Salam, some people think if Iran do not pressure the US so much, cooperates a little, and avoids confrontation, then the US might lift sanctions, and people's lives will improve. These kinds of opinions are heard more often during elections, suggesting Iran is the one to blame for the conflicts and that if we avoid fights, the other side will also stop fighting, believing sanctions can be removed through negotiation.
It seems simple. Do we want to keep fighting or solve the issue? If we want to continue the fight, let's prepare for its consequences. But if we want to resolve it, experts should give us solutions to end this conflict. Because prolonging it will only make life harder for people day by day.
Let's briefly review the history of Iran-US relations, to see who is truly responsible for the disputes. In fact, my thesis in American studies focused on instances where Iran, post-revolution, tried to end conflicts with the US, sometimes even making significant concessions and assisting the US. However, not only did these efforts fail to resolve issues, but conditions worsened. Take a few minutes to follow along, it's worth your time. Goodwill generates goodwill, they say, but is that the reality? Between 1982 and 1992, some American soldiers were held hostage in Lebanon. During this period, in January 1989, George H.W. Bush became president of the U.S. In his inaugural speech, he indirectly requested Iran's help in freeing the American hostages, saying, "If you prove your goodwill to us, rest assured, we will reciprocate, and this cycle of goodwill will continue."
There are today Americans who are held against their will in foreign lands. Assistance can be shown here and will be long remembered. Goodwill begets goodwill. Good faith can be a spiral that endlessly moves on. Great nations, like great men, must keep their word. When America says something, America means it, whether a treaty or an agreement or a vow made on marble steps.
Shortly afterward, direct communication was established through Mr. Picot, a UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs at the time. He relayed the U.S. message to Iranian officials. Then President Rafsanjani saw this as an opportunity, believing it was the perfect moment to show Iran's goodwill toward the U.S. and prove there was no enmity. After a series of events, Iran decided to showcase its goodwill by using its regional influence to help free the American hostages one by one. Rafsanjani expected that, in return, the U.S. might lift some sanctions or release parts of Iran's frozen assets. However, as soon as the last hostage arrived at the airport, the White House spokesperson, Marlin Fitzwater, came forward and announced, "From our perspective, nothing has changed. Iran is still a terrorist state." Mr. Picot, the UN mediator, recounts in his memoir The Man Without a Gun, page 4, that after all the hostages were freed, he was forced by the Americans to return to Iran, look Rafsanjani in the eye, and tell him there would be no goodwill or reciprocation from their side. Thus, the only result of Iran's goodwill was being labeled a terrorist state once again. Another example, the Conoco oil contract in late 1994. Iran sought to expand its oil fields on Siri Island in southern Iran and attract foreign investment. The deal was worth $1 billion for the foreign investor. While many believed this opportunity would go to the French company Total, Rafsanjani, wanting to show goodwill to the U.S., offered this lucrative deal to the American company Conoco instead. Initially, the Americans welcomed the offer, but eventually, realizing the economic benefits Iran would gain from the oil fields, not only did they reject the deal, but they imposed one of the harshest sanctions in history on Iran. This sanction, spearheaded by the Zionist lobby group AIPAC, saw President Bill Clinton sign 2 executive orders banning all American investments in Iran's energy sector. Congress later passed the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act, ILSA, which evolved into the Iran Sanctions Act, ISA, and persists to this day, preventing other countries from investing in Iran's energy sector. So, instead of improving relations, Iran's goodwill offer led to severe restrictions on its oil and gas exports. After September 11, the U.S. under the guise of fighting terrorism, invaded Afghanistan, aiming to eliminate al-Qaeda and the Taliban. However, lacking proper understanding of the region, they bombed empty or civilian areas and were struggling. Iran, seeking to secure its borders and mend relations with the U.S., decided to help. Through the Geneva Channel, Iran provided intelligence to the U.S. for 18 months, pinpointing terrorist hideouts. Ryan Crocker, the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, admitted that the Americans were amazed by Iran's intelligence capabilities and were pleased with the success of their operations. Yet, shockingly, during this very period when Iran was assisting the U.S., President Bush famously labeled Iran part of the axis of evil. One lesser-known instance occurred in 2003, during the early weeks of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, when President Khatami sent a confidential two-page letter to the U.S. The letter proposed resolving all U.S. grievances, Iran would cease support for Hezbollah and Hamas, provide transparency on weapons of mass destruction, refrain from intervening in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and reduce its influence in Iraq. In return, the U.S. was asked to lift sanctions, cease efforts to overthrow the Iranian regime, and stop supporting the MEK, an opposition group. The implementation process was briefly outlined in the letter. However, according to Colin Powell's aide, the White House's response to this peace proposal was, "We do not talk to evils." Trita Parsi, in his book Treacherous Alliance, page 248, states that Pentagon and White House officials interpreted the letter as a sign of Iran's weakness, viewing the concessions as desperation. They concluded that if Iran was this weak, there was no need to negotiate, but rather an opportunity to push for regime change. Regarding the JCPOA, as you all know, during President Rouhani's tenure, Iran and the U.S. held negotiations, and it was agreed that all sanctions would be lifted. However, after all those events, which you're already aware of, despite Iran fully adhering to its commitments, Obama, the Democrat, imposed new sanctions during the JCPOA and even extended some of the previous sanctions. Then Trump tore up the JCPOA and unilaterally withdrew from it. I've spent hours in class discussing the JCPOA with Dr. Zarif, and beyond all the technical details, I asked him, given the history of Iran-US relations, why did you agree to an obligation that was not legally binding for the U.S.? Because it wasn't approved by Congress. And knowing this obligation wasn't binding, why did we fully comply with all our commitments without waiting for reciprocal action? But well, let me be straightforward and blunt, we need to resolve this issue for ourselves once and for all and come to terms with the fact that even if we have no disputes with the U.S. and try to set aside all our problems, they don't want that. Not only will they not show goodwill, but they will interpret our concessions on our principles as a sign of weakness and, in fact, apply even more pressure. After the revolution, the presidents of Iran, namely, Mr. Rafsanjani, Khatami, and Rouhani, tried every possible way to show goodwill toward the United States in areas such as regional power, economics, intelligence, diplomacy, and even ideological compromises. But the result was the opposite. There is no difference between Democrats and Republicans, because this is one of the fundamental principles of U.S. foreign policy. It doesn't matter who becomes president, as they have a problem with our very nature and identity. As long as we remain the Islamic Republic and they remain the United States of America, we will never get along, just like two parallel lines. Now, this raises the question, wouldn't it be better for us to stop being the Islamic Republic so that we can become friends with the United States again? In future clips, God willing, I will provide examples and references from their foreign policy books to prove that becoming friends with the U.S. also comes with its own set of challenges. Even those countries that don't have issues with the U.S. are, in a different way, subjected to pressure and injustice from the United States. They may not face sanctions, but they pay a heavy price in other ways, because of their relationship with the U.S. So, let's collectively come to a decision and learn the truth about the United States from past experiences, and stop imposing this optimism and cognitive bias about the U.S. on this nation. After all, a wise person doesn't fall into the same hole multiple times, though our presidents have been falling time and time again. References to all of this, including page numbers and book titles, are available in my thesis, and you can refer to them. If you're interested, you can follow me on social media, where I share things that are rarely spoken so openly and honestly. Please share this with those you care about. Thank you so much for staying until the end.